Hi, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to our session. If you're joining us, you know that we're here for CUTRIC's second annual Low Carbon Smart Mobility Conference. So I'm pleased that you're able to join us. This afternoon in particular, we have this session that is focused on the city's perspective for autonomous shuttles. So I welcome you to this particular session to take a look at these pilot experiences. I'm Wendy Reuter. I'm your moderator and your host for this session. For the next hour, we'll be together. I've been at the Canadian Urban Transit Association for 7 years. Have worked in passenger transportation for the last 25, private and public side, and joined CUTA in the not-for-profit space, working with many transit systems and private operators and suppliers into the transit industry. So I'm really pleased to be here, and I'm really pleased that we're able to have this time to talk about autonomous shuttles from the city's perspective. Earlier today, we would have heard various perspectives from manufacturers as well as fleet operations and private operators. And I think it's really exciting that after a number of years talking about how shuttles might be able to fit into an urban mobility space and a lot of the work being done on the private side, that we see some pilots now emerging with cities in the places where we can closely deploy them for the mobility of our urban centers. So I'm really pleased we can bring to you 4 terrific panelists. They're going to discuss the shuttle pilots that they've been having in their communities. And we're going to take a look at how AV shuttles in Canada and globally can be part of this smart and shared mobility solutions for our cities. And we're also going to hear about some of the challenges that need to be surmounted if cities are going to help fight our challenges around climate change. So with that, I'd like to welcome our panelists. With us today, we have Primal Marie Sodanon. Primal is a consultant in innovations on autonomous vehicles, and he's joining us from the City of Montreal. Lindsay Whittington, many of you will have heard from Lindsay at prior CUTRIC conferences. Lindsay's project manager and strategic policy and innovation with the City of Toronto. Welcome, Lindsay. We also have Andrew Sedor. Andrew is the business development coordinator for transportation strategy with the City of Calgary. And Veronica Cyranosian. Veronica is the vice president at AECOM. Their new ventures in transportation, particularly in digital and innovative solutions for transportation. So welcome our panelists. I'm excited to hear your presentations. I know our audience is too, so we're going to jump right into it. Let's start with Primal. Primal, if you could introduce yourself, your organization, and let us know what you've been working on.
All right, thank you very much for having me, Wendy. Hi, everyone. I'm very happy to be here discussing this very interesting topic with all of you guys. So yes, I am a member of the Montreal Urban Laboratory. So I'll take a couple of seconds to introduce my team and what it is that we do. So just so you can take a look at my at the screen in front of you, the shuttle that you see on screen is the one that I will be talking about while discussing our experiment. So I have been working with the City of Montreal for about a year. I am specifically in charge of AVs and for this term in discussion, autonomous shuttles. Prior to that, I was working with the Keolis team when we implemented the Candiac initiative in 2018. So I've been working in the field of AVs for the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years, and also working on more broadly innovative vehicles as well. So the Montreal Urban Lab, what we do is we are a team of professionals working on different topics that have to do with digital cities and experimenting innovation. Our approach is threefold. So innovation, facilitating processes, keeping citizens involved and at the very heart of our processes, and also working with data and everything we have to learn through the use of such data, be it on the field of AVs or also other topics or other subjects that might be of interest. So a couple of our projects are innovative procurement, Montreal Wi-Fi, open data, 5Gs, Smart City Challenge, and obviously, last but not least, the autonomous vehicles that I have the pleasure of discussing with you guys today. So just to dive into the heart of the matter, we ran an experiment in 2019 in Montreal in the Hochelaga-Maisonneuve borough. What we did is we had two autonomous vehicles from Easy Mile operated by Transdev along a 1.5 kilometer route. So we had two shuttles in service. The duration of the experiment was about 6 weeks, roughly, a little more if I count the dry runs before we took live operation. The ridership was pretty good considering the brief amount of time. 6 weeks isn't that long, but still we managed to have about little less than 4,000 people riding the shuttles, with close to 100 people riding it every day. What I have to mention, and it will be important for in later discussion, is that we had to revert to manual operation of the shuttle at very specific points of the route. So the objective was driving a shuttle from 2 points of interest that were the Olympic Stadium and the farmer market, as I said, 1.5 kilometers a little further. What we learned from that experiment, our key findings were that the context and the setting was representative of the standard living conditions. So we had the shuttles run in what could be seen as any regular urban setting. A neighborhood where people live, people do their groceries, and people have stuff to visit. In general, the public reception was pretty good. So 2 shuttles were enough to cover the whole territory, and the frequency, even though they were kind of slow, it was still satisfactory given the needs expressed by the citizens. Very educational, both from the general public, but also for the services of the city. We learned lots of things on a technical standpoint, as well on I would say, psychological and user acceptance standpoint as well. But we would have wanted to have an experiment a little longer than 6 weeks, because even though it was very rich, it was quite a bit narrow and short in order to dive in more deeply into what we could have learned from the experiment. But that leaves more room for learning new things. The limits we went away with 3 limits from the experiment. The first one being the capacity of the shuttle to recognize and appraise its surrounding is pretty limited. Decision making, the shuttles were not able to work and to deviate from the route that was given to them. And also, when it came to adapting to climatic conditions, we saw a little bit of a struggle there. So all in all, what we would like to summarize is those shuttles with cartography technology, they are relevant. They are very promising, but they still have limits to overcome in order to be deployed on I would say, standard operation for the benefit of our citizens. So this is pretty much what we take away from our experiment in Montreal. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Really appreciate the insights into the work that you're doing with the Montreal Urban Lab. I think it was really fascinating to hear the focus on the customer, the end user. I'm really pleased to see that as we're talking about how we might be able to use this technology to move people, we've got some good perspectives on the people experience. So I look forward to hearing more about your comments on that. So now I'd like to turn it over to Lindsay. Lindsay, if you could introduce yourself, your City of Toronto and your work there, and some of the things you've been doing with your pilot.
Thanks, Wendy, and thanks to CUTRIC for organizing the panel. It's always really great to be able to kind of have an exchange with my counterparts in other cities working on similar topics. My name is Lindsay Wigginton. I'm a project manager at the City of Toronto on what's called our Strategic Policy and Innovation Unit. Our team is about 8 people, and we deal with all kinds of emerging transportation issues on behalf of the Transportation Division. So including automated vehicles, but also things like micromobility, and other kinds of emerging challenges. I'm actually coming to you today from my hometown of Brighton, Ontario. So the moderators have promised me that if the birds in the background get too loud, they'll let me know. I wanted to say a little bit about my teammates as well. I work really closely on this project with Fahad Khan from the city, as well as my manager, Ryan Lanyon. I think that's all I've got for intro. Great. So just to say a little bit about sort of the policy framework in which our work at the City of Toronto is situated. Our team was mandated in 2016, so a while ago now, by Council to sort of help Council develop a position on automated vehicles. And as our team started digging into that, the first sort of dedicated AV staff for a city in North America was appointed. And as staff started digging in, we realized that, this is a really big conversation that we need to have beyond just the transportation division. And so ultimately a working group was established that brought together all 31 divisions at the City of Toronto. So including, social services, fleet services, public health, for everyone to think about what the implications of transportation automation could be for their division and for the services that they offer to Torontonians. And the result of that is this Automated Vehicles Tactical Plan, which was approved by City Council in October of last year, which sets out several dozen tactics that are going to take place in the coming years in order to really prepare the city for the arrival of automated vehicles. I'll say a little bit more about that vision in a moment. One other piece of work we've done more recently is really looking at automated transit from an economic development perspective, especially given some of the conversations around recovery and rebuild. And we had Mars develop sort of a draft strategy for us about what specifically supporting that industry from an economic development perspective could look like. And so some of those findings inform our work as well. Coming out of the AV Tactical Plan, we do have a shorter term 3-year readiness schedule, and the automated shuttle trial that I'm speaking about today really is part of that more short term 3-year plan. So the Automated Vehicles Tactical Plan, I think what's most important about it is it does not set a new vision for the City of Toronto. Really, it scanned all of the policies and priorities that we have already, especially as it relates to transportation, and said, okay, how can AVs support that? And in the case that transportation automation might actually threaten that vision, what are the things we need to put in place to make sure that that doesn't happen? And so what really emerged from that is that the city is taking a transit-centric approach to automation in order to really achieve that existing vision of integrated mobility for all Torontonians. And so from this, we developed the idea that it would be appropriate to try piloting an automated transit shuttle. I think what does set our pilot apart is that it is really integrated into the transit system. And so we're fully partnering with the Toronto Transit Commission and Metrolinx, which are the 2 transit agencies in our region, to deliver this. And the 3 of us sit on a steering committee that makes all of the decisions around this trial. I want to say a little bit about the potential use cases for automated shuttles, because the specific application we're trialing in this first attempt is maybe what's thought of more commonly as the use case for automated shuttles, which is a first mile, last mile service. So in other words, filling a geographical gap in the city's network. And TTC has done some work internally to think about what some of the other use cases for automated shuttles could be in the future. And so you see them identified on the slide here. There's also time gaps in service, industrial areas, so serving shift workers, and overnight service. And I think as we think about what scaling or growing these kinds of trials could look like going forward, it's important to think about those use cases. And those are perhaps more specific to big cities like Toronto and might not be the same use cases that could emerge in smaller or more regional cities. Yeah, and maybe I can say more about that in the discussion. You see here some of the key pillars of our service plan. So it's designed to be sort of a commuter peak hour service. We are intending to operate in mixed traffic, which is maybe one of the bolder or more challenging aspects of our service plan. And we are aiming to trial for 6 to 12 months. We were initially planning to launch in September of this year. We're kind of in the middle of the procurement process right now. Obviously, with COVID-19, there are some delays that we're going to need to incorporate, and we're developing a set of criteria about when it would be appropriate, safe, and feasible to launch, and happy to speak about that more. So I know I only have a couple minutes left. I'll just kind of throw some of the challenges out there and we can discuss more afterward. But I think for the transit industry, I think the challenges in front of us, and that's really been talked about in some of the other sessions today, I think developers will need to see transit agencies as their most important clients, and so therefore to design with those in mind. And that means meeting the bar of all the local regulations, including, I've mentioned here, so accessibility, privacy, and other key regulations in place in the jurisdiction that they're looking to operate, as well as supporting cities in doing what we're doing here, which is sharing information so that we're not reinventing the wheel and that in fact we're building on what's been learned before. And I know I need to wrap up, I think that ourselves as public agencies also have some challenges to meet, and that includes things like adjusting our standards to account for this new kind of transit, working together, and also really clearly articulating what our needs are to the market so that we can all work together to design those solutions. Thanks.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. I really appreciated hearing about the thinking behind using automated shuttles, automated large vehicles for more than first mile, last mile. Really interested to hear more about those perspectives and to assisting with public transit in a broader range. See a lot of connections between some thinking on movements towards on-demand for underserviced areas as well. Look forward to hearing more from you on that. So let's turn our to Andrew. Andrew, if you could now tell us a little bit about yourself, your work at the City of Calgary, and the initiatives that you're working on.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So my role as the business development coordinator at the City of Calgary is to work with industry and academia to deliver some pretty cool projects. So just to give you an idea of some of the stuff that we've done, we created this thing called the Living Labs program, where we open up city assets in order for industry and academia to test and grow. So some examples of this have been converting our industrial areas, some of our underutilized land and industrial areas to drone sites, opening up our snow dump sites to autonomous vehicle testing. And that's just two of the 30 projects that we've done over the past 2 years. We're doing a really cool project with the University of Calgary and their wearables team, looking at how people understand and feel in space using wearable tech. So that's a super cool project that's going on. And right now what's eating up most of my time is I'm running the e-scooter program in Calgary, which has been interesting and controversial. But what I'm here today to talk to you about is our Ella pilot, which was an autonomous vehicle pilot that Calgary ran 2 years ago, back in September 2018. So it ran between our Calgary Zoo LRT site and then our science center. So it's about 1 kilometer there and back. We wouldn't have been able to do this pilot without Pacific Western Transportation. They came on board as a sponsor and actually ran the shuttle. So our job was to set up the site. So it actually ran on a service roadway. So it was a gravel roadway. We closed it down to other traffic, so it was a dedicated road. We had quite high ridership. So within that month period, we had 4,500 people. I think this was largely due to it served as a science center exhibit. So it really fit in with the science center vibe. And we actually had some other private donors come in and set up a autonomous vehicle basically station at the Telespark Science Center to showcase what autonomous vehicle technology can do. And along with the pilot, there was also 3 University of Calgary research projects. So these are the people involved in making the Calgary pilot a reality. So Transport Canada gave us some funding through the ACATS program. University of Calgary did those 3 studies, one of which was a survey study. And then Pacific Western really pulled its weight and allowed the pilot to operate. Maybe the one other piece that I'll touch on that was really cool is the high precision GPS unit that allowed the shuttle to operate, which is just one of the many systems that was on the Easy Mile vehicle, was actually created here in Calgary. So that was a really cool piece of the technology. And we actually had some of the people who created the technology down on site, and they could experience their work. So the main goals of the pilot was to understand how autonomous vehicle operated in Calgary. We can get more into it in the discussion, but some of the issues that we faced was the dust from the dirt road actually triggered some of the sensors. So our roads team had to lay down calcium chloride. The other goal, increase public awareness of the technology, gather public feedback. So the U of C did a really good job of tracking what people thought of the shuttle. And we actually are using that information for our municipal development plan, Calgary Transportation Plan, which is going through a revisit right now and will be published next year. And then what I think actually the biggest benefit is helping inform highly developed, qualified public sector officials. So us working with the province and federal government in order to understand how you can make autonomous vehicles a reality, and actually getting into the nitty gritty, like what are the insurance requirements? How do you import a vehicle? So some of those are actually the biggest learnings. So the conclusion from the pilot was the technology is here, kind of. It's not to the point where you can just plunk an autonomous vehicle down or autonomous shuttle down and have it run and have no operator. From the studies that we did, people are most comfortable operating in a separate right of way, so not in mixed traffic. We don't think that these will replace conventional transit. You have to serve a really specific purpose, so you're not going to substitute a regular bus for an autonomous shuttle, but it's great for that last mile solution. And for us, if you're going to do a pilot, you need partners. I don't think we had the internal expertise in order to run something like this. So whether you're partnering with CUTRIC or one of the other operators, it's really important to have that. So thank you.
Really appreciate those perspectives from Calgary and some of the specific, like, hands-on testing that's being done in the field. Really looking forward to hearing some of your perspectives about the use for shuttles with transit. And before I turn over to Veronica, I just wanted to remind the audience we're going to have Q&As after we hear from Veronica. So think about this now. There's a chat box over to the side. If you've been wanting to ask any of our panelists a question, there's the time to type them in. We'll have some time afterwards. We'll circle back to those. So with that, let's hear from Veronica. If you can tell us a little bit about yourself and obviously the work at AECOM and the projects that you're working on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Wendy, and thanks for CUTRIC for putting this together. I'm Veronica Cernosian. I'm based in Oakland, California, so other side of the border, and I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about some of the city perspectives and lessons learned that we have from working with U.S. cities across the country. I'm with AECOM. We're a global infrastructure firm that designs, builds, finances, and operates critical infrastructure across 150 countries around the world. I'm specifically in our digital and innovation group, and my background is transportation planning with the local government. And so most of what I work on is digital and innovative solutions for mobility planning, design, and deployment. I wanted to talk about some of the kind of key highlights and things that we're seeing from U.S. cities. And really, we're seeing three approaches and key themes or lessons learned. One is proactive scenario planning to justify and put the AV shuttles in the context of greater community needs. Two is using AV shuttles to address unique use cases and really drive manufacturers to develop products that meet community goals. And then three is integrating into the larger transit system. So first, for scenario planning, we've developed this tool called Mobilytics. You see the URL here that enables us to do really quick scenario planning because there's so much uncertainty around automated technologies in terms of when they might be deployed, under what circumstances, in terms of having fees or not, occupancy requirements or not, level of public acceptance, that we were hearing from U.S. cities that there's so much uncertainty, we don't know what to do. So we developed this scenario planning tool that enables us to weigh those things, modify assumptions, and see how that might play out in the potential future. We did this for Washington, D.C., and what we found was that if we don't assume any sort of policy or regulatory intervention, automated technologies could lead to a dramatic increase in vehicle miles traveled of 66%. And so what this did for D.C. was this gave them the justification to say, we need to do something now to help make sure that an automated future is also a shared future with transit serving as the backbone of the mobility network. And so this provided them justification and analysis to support an AV shuttle pilot that they're now embarking on. So we think that analysis to put these into context is key to show that we're not just trying to roll out technology for its own sake, but really to serve a need and to prevent outcomes like increases in vehicle miles traveled that we might not want to see. The next main lesson learned or theme that we're seeing from the US is really using these AV shuttles to address a specific use case and need. So for Minnesota, this was a project that I worked on several years ago now, and they really wanted to use automated technologies for their full-size bus fleet, and also recognizing that these technologies need to operate in snow conditions. And at the time, there were really no demonstrations or pilots happening in snow or very cold conditions. And so we were able to work with them to define the testing scenarios, moving from a controlled environment to a public environment, solicit vendors. They ended up choosing EasyMile, and then conduct and operate this study that demonstrated that, yes, the vehicles can operate in snow. I think similar to what Premal was saying, we did find that there was a need for driver or operator interventions in very windy conditions, but it successfully demonstrated it, and it helped Minnesota DOT move their agency towards integrating these technologies, but it also helped push the industry to develop technologies that could operate in these specific environments that our cities need. The other example in terms of serving the local context and need is for the city of Philadelphia. We're working right now for Pennsylvania DOT, the city, and the Philadelphia Industrial Development Corporation. They have a specific site where they want to bridge the gap and use these technologies to bring together two parts of the community that had been divided by highway infrastructure. So we're doing the concept of operations for them now, so that this isn't just kind of a shuttle going in circles in a parking lot, but it really serves that local context and need. The concept of operations will provide the operational framework for implementing the AV and sets specific metrics and targets in terms of supporting bicycle and pedestrian access, as well as linking to transit and creating complete streets. So really putting that AV deployment within the framework of what the local specific needs are there in Philadelphia. And then finally, the last kind of key takeaway or lessons learned is making sure that these technologies are not just kind of standalone demonstrations or pilots, but that they're really integrated with the transit network, and recognizing that if we want a future sustainable system, we're going to need these to play together with transit, and that high capacity transit is the most sustainable option. So for TriMet in the city of Portland, we're working on evaluating connected and automated technologies in two ways. One is to use automation for a shared transit way where we have light rail vehicles and buses operating in a shared corridor, and using automation to help them both operate safely and achieve operational efficiency and the target speeds we're looking at, but also using an AV shuttle to link a station to a community college that's a little bit off the corridor, a little bit further than people might be willing to walk. So using the technology in two ways, fully integrated with the transit system, to make sure that we can expand access. So I just wanted to wrap up with some of the key lessons learned that we have working with cities across the US. One is to be proactive, recognizing that we're not passive recipients of this technology, and through proactive scenario planning, we could understand how it could play out in communities and take measures right now to make sure that as these technologies roll out in our communities, they're done so in a thoughtful way. Two is really a needs-based approach, that automation or shuttles are not an end in and of themselves, but they're really there to serve our community needs, specifically around access, sustainability, and equity. For example, we know in the United States, at least Black, Indigenous, and people of color are subject to pedestrian fatalities at a much higher rate. So can we use the safety that's promised with automation to target that? Or can we use it to provide more access to women who we know tend to travel in off-peak periods when traditional transit doesn't serve them? So really focusing AV shuttles on those specific needs. And last is making sure that they're fully integrated with the overall transportation network to increase multimodal options and support those high-capacity networks. So I thank you all, and I think we'll go into Q&A. I welcome any questions anyone might have.
I'm mute here. Thanks, Veronica. That was terrific. I really appreciated hearing the thinking around different use cases, and specifically around access, equity, safety, and how autonomous shuttles might be used in terms of thinking about the community benefits that it can bring into cities. But in particular, I was really struck by your metric around the potential increase in vehicle miles traveled. Is that 66%?
Yep, that was for Washington, D.C. So we looked at 3 different scenarios with different assumptions. And so if we don't assume any interventions in terms of taxes or fees on zero occupancy vehicle or cordon pricing or congestion pricing, absent any of those sort of interventions, most of the scenarios we saw would have an increase in vehicle miles traveled. And so that sort of data, I think, is really useful with communicating to people that, it's worthwhile to take proactive steps now to make sure that as these technologies roll out, we can take advantage of all the benefits and minimize any of those negative outcomes.
Yeah, terrific. Thank you. Terrific presentations, everybody. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. We're now going to go into our Q&A section of this session. And I'll remind the audience, if you have some questions, use the chat box, and the moderators here will bring those forward to us. But I'd like to start off. With a question across all of the panelists, if I may. So we're talking about automated shuttles from a city's perspective, and the places that we're talking about, the pilots where you're operating, there's significant transit operations, and so I think it's intriguing for us to be talking about the role of autonomous shuttles in major cities. I'd like to talk about smaller ones as well, where we've got significant transit operations, and autonomous shuttles have often been depicted as potentially competing. And I think some of the statistics that Veronica mentioned about the potential for vehicle miles traveled to increase with autonomous vehicles that are personal vehicles are maybe one of the challenges that we need to be thinking about. But the shuttles have often been depicted as competing with transit services. So I'd like to hear from you what you think the main benefits are of autonomous shuttles from a transit perspective, and maybe we can start with you, Andrew.
So just from our perspective, one of the reasons why we chose the site that we did is because we didn't want to detract from transit ridership or that walking and cycling mode. So we actually connected ours in with our LRT station. My one issue with it is it wasn't right next to the LRT station. The person actually had to walk about 200 meters in order to get to it, just because we had to operate on a dedicated piece of right-of-way. But I think in making those last mile connections, that it can be really valuable, right? So connecting LRT with the science center, that would prove beneficial. That being said, I don't think automated shuttles should be a Band-Aid for bad urban planning. So in my perspective, that science center should have been built right next to the LRT station.
All right, so we need to be thinking about the hubs and interoperability for these. Lindsay, how about from your perspective?
It's a really great question. I think I'll say a couple things. One is that simply, at least in the City of Toronto, there's provincial legislation through the City of Toronto Act that protects the TTC's exclusive right to deliver transit in the City of Toronto. So as we think about, the business models that work, it is really thinking about, okay, how can we support the gaps in what we do have as a transit service? And the TTC is also mandated by Toronto City Council to cover 90% of the city within 400 meters of transit. So even when we were once we decided that a geographical gap was the use case that we wanted to fill for this project, we really only had 10% of the city that has no transit coverage, and that's where we started for this case. As I mentioned, and my colleagues from the Toronto Transit Commission can speak to this better than me, but the TTC has done work thinking through what the other use cases for automated shuttles could be, as I mentioned. So like overnight service for shift workers, where there's time gaps. There may be coverage in certain areas, but the frequency may not be what we would hope it to be. And I think a helpful frame for thinking about this, some of the thinkers about transit, I'm thinking like Jarrett Walker and others, talk about how transit sort of holds these competing demands, which is first of all providing an essential service, and second of all trying to draw and attract new riders to expand net new ridership. And so I think being more explicit about when we're trying to apply shuttles in case one and when we're trying to apply shuttles in case two can be really helpful. And I think certainly with COVID-19, we've really seen the ways in which transit does provide an essential service. And so thinking through, I think as a priority, what are the ways that automated shuttles can augment that?
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. Primel.
Well, my answer would be that the advantage of autonomous shuttles is that, in my particular case, in the Montreal case, they go where mass transit doesn't really go or isn't perhaps so much suitable. In the sense that, I mean, if I take at my particular context, we're talking about a small neighborhood where the flux and the activity is lesser than it would be in a, I would say, more dynamic area. So would you want to deploy a mass transit or a 52-seater bus, urban bus, in such a, I would say, a more intimate neighborhood? Perhaps not. That would be an overkill. This is why, you know, a solution such as a small, you know, nimble enough AV such as that one would serve as a great complement to a system that is already, I would say, massively implanted. What we did is we wanted to connect 2 points of interest, but we didn't want to bring a huge city bus into it and then disrupt, I would say, the less dynamic feeling of the neighborhood. So
yeah. All right, Veronica, just quickly, because I've got a follow-on question from one of from our audience on this.
I think other panelists covered it beautifully in terms of the use cases and focusing on filling gaps and expanding service coverage. The only thing I might add is that, you know, ahead of full automated vehicle deployment, there's a lot we could take advantage of in terms of safety for driver and operator assistance, whether that's active lane departure warning systems or precision docking at stations. There are a lot of technologies there that can help our operators and can help transit agencies provide their services better that we could learn from the automated vehicles.
Okay, so we talked a lot about how autonomous shuttles might be able to complement the gaps in transit and augment service. But one of the questions that we have from our audience is there a maximum length in thinking about this first mile, last mile, or of the gaps? Do you have any sense of where autonomous shuttles might fit into the length of time they might fit into complement transit? And along that line, we've also been talking about how shuttles might play into fixed route transit. Any comments you have in terms of how these shuttles might complement and play a role in transit on demand? Andrew.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to say, I think a lot depends on the speed at which the shuttles travel at. So if you're, operating at 12 kilometers per hour, you wouldn't want to cover 10 kilometers of distance, right? But if it's a short 1 kilometer stretch, then 12K might be suitable. If you can get them at a little bit of higher speed, then people might be more open to traveling a longer distance in the shuttle.
Right. Terrific. Premal, I think you were looking to answer that as well?
No, my sentiment exactly, Andrew. Yes, absolutely. This is exactly the issue that we have encountered with our own vehicle. It was the slow speed that made sense for us to have a relatively short distance rather than pushing further than a mile or a mile and a half.
Okay, so with that, we've been talking about the role of autonomous shuttles vis-a-vis the city and how they can complement transit. From your pilots, you've been looking at the technology, you've been looking at passenger use. Could you comment a little bit on the transit systems connection, their readiness to start thinking about bringing autonomous shuttles into their fleets and what that roadmap might look like?
If I may answer, operating an AV isn't the issue. The manpower is there, the knowledge is there, the professionals are there. But I would say the issue is getting them to perform as expected. This is where you would have issues. Getting them to react accordingly in mixed traffic and to be sufficiently and technologically advanced and evolved in order to have a better assessment of what the environment is and take the right action. This is where we need some more work to be done.
Okay, I saw a few nods there. Andrew's got his hand up. Go ahead, Andrew. You're still muted, my Andrew.
Oh, there we go. So Premal nailed it. I think there's really three things for cities. The first is the technological aspect. You basically need a technology that functions close to 100% of the time, or is as reliable as normal transit. You can't have the thing breaking down 1 out of 10 trips, and being able to deal with multiple environmental conditions. The other big thing that's going to be a barrier for cities is legislation, which is usually a provincial responsibility. So being able to work with the province to put the right legislation in place for the Traffic Safety Act to allow for these kind of things. And I think the biggest thing for jurisdictions is just the economic viability of these. So if you require an operator in one of these vehicles, then what is the economic advantage to having an automated shuttle? I think that's probably the biggest barrier, especially in a post-COVID world where transit systems are reeling with economic difficulties. Is that a service that they can really provide right now?
Okay. Veronica, if you've unmuted, go ahead, and then I have a question for you.
Yeah, I just had one thing to add. The other thing that we've found is that there are quite a few potential challenges with interoperability of systems. And so, for example, if we have automatic passenger counters on buses or automatic vehicle location systems or loop detection systems for rail, positive train control, all of these systems sometimes are integrated, sometimes are not, and sometimes they communicate with intersection traffic signals on traffic management centers and sometimes not. So that interoperability, I think, is key because these vehicles especially need to be able to know where other types of vehicles in the transit system are, communicate with them, and be able to be managed at a corridor or even citywide perspective. And so that setting that from the outset so that you have interoperable systems, I think is a pretty important thing for cities to consider.
Yeah. Now, Veronica, thank you for that. I think we've kind of got some good perspectives on the larger cities' role there. With your work with a broader range of cities, what sort of challenges, what additional challenges might there be for smaller cities looking to deploy automated shuttles, automated vehicles into their urban mobility solutions?
Well, I think all size cities have this issue, but especially for smaller jurisdictions, budget limitations are an issue. And so initially there was a lot of interest and willingness by the shuttle providers to do kind of pro bono demonstrations or pilots or things like that. And I think we've moved beyond that phase. And so one approach that we've seen is cities with like-minded goals creating consortiums so that they can do kind of joint projects, sharing lessons learned among them. And that's one way they've kind of overcome that issue of limited resources. But I do think kind of building upon what Lindsay was saying, there are a lot of interesting use cases and for expanding transit service coverage that rural areas are really, in some cases, better suited to, and they have potentially more control over the right-of-way and less traffic volume. So there are some benefits there too.
Yeah, there's some opportunities and some additional challenges. All right, thanks for that. Andrew, go ahead.
I just wanted to add one last bit. For smaller jurisdictions and even for a jurisdiction the size of Calgary, I think one of the big issues is just vehicle maintenance. If we want to be the owner operator, if anything ever goes wrong with the vehicle, do you have people on staff who can fix a LiDAR, or are you going to have to be in contact with Easy Miles head office in France in order to get a fix, right? So just thinking about maintenance, the vehicles are quite sophisticated. So do you have people on staff that can deal and fix those problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Good. That's a very good point. Thank you. So with that, Andrew had mentioned some challenges with respect to COVID, and I've been thinking about that as well. You've been running these really insightful pilots. Your cities are learning a lot about them. We're learning a lot from your experience, and it sounds like there's the challenges that these have been covered, and yet we want to move forward. So what are the next steps? What do we do next? It sounds like there's policy, there's regulation, and there's technology challenges in particular. So what do we tackle? What are the next steps? And what does this look like in this environment right now of COVID? Are we pressing forward in this environment, or are we in a holding pattern until we can get to the other side and refocus on this important work? So I'll open it up to Whoever would like to answer the question first. Lindsay.
I can take a crack at that one, I guess, just for some context. So we made the decision to go through a formal procurement process to bring about our pilot. And part of that was around doing some cultural learning around, are our institutions ready to procure these kinds of vehicles? And so we're actually in the middle of that process as COVID hit. And so what we're looking at is, do we press forward or what makes sense? And basically where we're at as a steering committee is that we need to have a certain set of criteria in place to be able to say, yes, it's feasible and responsible to launch. And so that has to do with, there not being a state of emergency declared, the province being in a certain stage of reopening, where the medical officers of health are at in terms of recommending safety practices. The reality is that on transit, the reality is it is a small vehicle and it isn't going to be possible to physically distance, especially because we're expecting there to be an operator on board. But the other thing we have to monitor is transit demand. And so because ours is a first mile, last mile service, it's connecting to a GO station. GO ridership is down 90% right now. So we also need to monitor, both transit service levels and transit demand levels. So we need to, I think, be cautious. However, there's a concept I've been reading a bit about right now called chronocentrism, which is sort of our tendency to think that whatever our times are will last forever. And while I think the impacts of COVID will, change the world in unimaginable ways, I think also there is really potentially a scenario where we start to have huge amounts of transit demand again in our cities, and I think we need to be ready. And so I think we do need to be pushing these projects to be as ready as possible so that when it is safe to do so, we can move forward and not kind of lose time working toward the transit systems that we need.
Yeah, to that point, it may even be an opportunity to see how people are traveling differently, making different travel choices, and how automated shuttles might play into the decisions that they can take around using shared mobility as well. Yeah. Andrew.
Not too much more to add. I think Lindsay nailed it. I know as the City of Calgary, I don't think we're actively exploring any further autonomous shuttle deployments. I view it more as a tool that we have in our tool belt. So if something does arise, a problem, that we'd be able to look into automated shuttles as a potential fix. So something like connecting our LRT with our airport. You might have too narrow of a right of way for full LRT. And so you might say, well, what's another option where you basically have two stations and need something in between there? An automated shuttle might be a great solution.
Okay. And any other thoughts on what needs to happen next steps? Primel?
Well, I see the impact of COVID-19 as a catalyst to push further my agenda for 100% driverless experiment, in the sense that removing the operator on board would also help safeguard his health or limit his exposition to risk, and also it's one more it's an additional capacity added to the vehicle. So I'm thinking, so this is the angle that I want to take in order to further that agenda for an eventual 2021 experiment, 100% driverless.
I heard on an earlier session that the suggestion was that drivers are so good at care and control that they would be well suited in a dispatch control center working on the autonomous shuttles as well. All right.
Yeah.
Sorry, Veronica, I think you have your mic open.
Yes.
Welcome.
I would just add that, yes, I think what we've seen is a lot more attention to and interest in real-time data because of the crisis, and looking at anonymized cell phone or credit card data to understand how and when people are moving. And so in terms of doing that more real-time dynamic analysis, I think that could help inform potential future automated shuttles. And then the other thing is, to the extent that we could use automated technologies to protect operators, that's potentially one way the situation would impact future deployments. But I think ultimately what the pandemic has shown is gaps in our system, areas where we're not serving people as well as they can. And so I think that, or I would hope that would help us refocus on looking at our customer needs, looking at changes in travel patterns, and again, using automation as a tool to serve those, not necessarily pushing ahead of it just because it's an initiative in and of itself, but a tool to serve those rider needs.
Okay, terrific. I'm just noticing we're getting close to the conclusion of our session. I want to make sure that we've got a few minutes for each of our panelists to offer some final words, final commentary, any rebuttals, any thoughts that have emerged because of other panelists' commentary? Prumel, let's start with you.
Well, I would say that we have been working with autonomous shuttles for the past 4 or 5 years, and I think we're pretty much getting to the extent of what we know about them. I think they've demonstrated pretty much what they were, the extent of their capabilities, and I think it would be time either to close that chapter and start envisioning, other either use cases or other forms of public-oriented AVs. And this is what I'm looking for. This is what I'm looking ahead for. I would say 2021 and the years ahead.
Okay, Veronica, closing comments.
Looking ahead, I think we just need to continue being proactive and framing these within community context, making sure we're serving local needs, especially equity needs that have been recently even more apparent, and making sure they're integrated and supportive of our public transportation systems.
All right, Andrew.
I still think that the transit operator plays a really important role. It's not just the role of the driver, but they're the person who checks the fares. They're the person who provides that level of security. And so it's not just addressing the driving aspect, but you still need to fulfill those other aspects. So whether you do that by camera or you have station attendants, I think you still need to look at the kind of holistic picture of what autonomy means and addressing some of those more human concerns.
Awesome. Lindsay.
It's just a small comment, but we didn't dig into it too much. It's just really around the technical specifications around accessibility of these vehicles. And so to scale in Ontario, they've got to meet the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act. And we're not quite seeing that in the market yet. And so I would just challenge industry to take a good look at that and work with transit agencies to integrate that into the vehicles.
Yeah, appreciate that. Circling back to your earlier comment about understanding the needs of transit systems. So with that, I'm going to thank our audience for joining us. I'd like to invite our audience for thanking our panelists. You've been terrific. We've really appreciated the presentations that you brought, the learnings that you've had from your pilots are really important. I encourage your continued work, and I hope we have another opportunity soon to hear the next steps that you are taking. And then we can have an opportunity to share that again. So thank you again. It's been my pleasure to join you, and bye for now.
Thank you. Bye.
And everyone else, we'll see you in the next session.